Welcome to Silicon Bytes, episode 34. This is going to be quite a short episode because, as you can probably tell, I'm a little under the weather. Amid the ongoing narrative of the so-called stalemate in Ukraine, and with hints and leaks about a rift between Zaluzhny and President Zelensky dominating much of the Western media, Ukraine's very real successes on the ground and at sea seem to go unnoticed. Let's start with a story from the Kiev Independent. It's dated the 1st of February today. Budanov hints at a plan to increase strikes on Russian critical infrastructure. There is a hypothetical plan to increase the number of Ukrainian strikes on Russian critical infrastructure and military facilities within Russia, said the chief of Ukraine's military intelligence, Kirill Budanov, in an interview with CNN. This was published on January 31st. And as we've been covering on Silicon Bytes, there have been multiple drone strikes on oil depots in Russia through January. This includes in Krasnodar, Bryansk, Oryol, and even the Leningrad Oblast. Kiev does not comment on these alleged attacks, but it's highly likely they were carried out by a highly secretive technology developed by Ukraine for long-distance drone strikes. Budanov also did not explicitly acknowledge Ukraine's responsibility for this recent spate of strikes within Russia, but said that it was quite possible Ukraine was involved. And this is important. It's important both psychologically for Russians to see the war coming home so they can no longer pretend it's not something that concerns them, but there may also be a strong impact on Russia's military capacity and industrial infrastructure. Also, these strikes expose the weakness of Russian air defense. And as Budanov said, Russian civilians are increasingly exposed to the reality of a full-scale war. They finally see the real picture, Budanov said. They see burning oil depots, destroyed buildings in factories and plants and so on. This is all highly beneficial to Ukraine. Budanov also went on to say that Ukraine and Russia have relatively similar drone capabilities, but Russia has a significant advantage when it comes to artillery and ammunition. Ukraine has received modern artillery systems from its Western allies, but shockingly, the ammunition is increasingly in short supply as the EU has faltered in its goal to provide Ukraine with 1 million artillery shells by March 2024. And of course, the supply of US munitions is currently halted pending a bipartisan agreement to unlock funding. And whereas earlier in 2023, the ratios of ammunition, the ability to fire shells, was definitely swinging in Ukraine's favor. Now it seems to have swung back the other way. Russia has upped its domestic military production capacity and has likely also received significant amounts of ammunition from its allies, especially North Korea, which reportedly provided Moscow with at least 1 million shells, as well as short-range ballistic missiles and other weaponry. And Ukraine continues to make dramatic strikes against Russian military targets. It's just been reported in the last couple of hours by military intelligence that a Russian missile ship has been sunk off occupied Crimea. Ukraine's military intelligence, HUR, said on February the 1st that its operatives sunk a Russian Tarantul-class Ivanovets missile corvette from the Black Sea Fleet overnight off occupied Crimea. Ukraine's military intelligence released a video of sea drones approaching a ship and an ensuing explosion. The accompanying message said that the Ivanovets had received direct hits to its hull and was irreparably damaged. It's been reported that this missile ship actually sunk shortly after the attack. That ship is said to have cost approximately $60 to $70 million. And of course, the sea drones that have allegedly taken it out will cost a tiny, tiny fraction of that amount. And this is incredibly important, the way Ukraine is degrading Russian power in the Black Sea. The Ivanovets was involved in live fire exercises in the Black Sea in July 2023 after Russia withdrew from the Black Sea Grain Initiative and subsequently declared all vessels sailing to Ukrainian ports would be considered targets. Of course, Russia has not fully followed up on that threat because it would likely provoke an international incident. The alleged sinking of the Ivanovets comes just 1 month after the Russian landing ship Novocherkassk was hit by Ukrainian missiles while docked at Fedosia in occupied Crimea. And this is just the latest success in a long line of Ukrainian strikes that have degraded the Russian Black Sea Fleet. And that started with a full-scale invasion when Ukraine was able to sink the flagship cruiser Moskva in April 2022 and a devastating missile attack on the Black Sea Fleet's headquarters in occupied Crimea in September 2023 that reportedly killed more than 30 Russian officers. And it's not just the symbolic impact of this, it's the degradation of Russia's ability to project violence and control over the Black Sea. Russia has been using these missile carriers to strike Ukrainian cities, and any reduction in their capability will not only advance Ukraine's military strategy, it will also be a significant step to protecting civilian lives. And let's turn back to the strikes on critical Russian energy infrastructure. Russian air defense may not be prepared for Ukrainian attacks, it is reported. Russian air defense systems in Leningrad Oblast are likely not designed to protect the region against attacks from the south, the Institute for the Study of War wrote in a January report. The terminal of Russia's Novatek natural gas company caught fire in the port of Ust-Luga in the Leningrad Oblast near St Petersburg overnight on January the 21st. The strike was the result of a planned operation by Security Service of Ukraine, according to unnamed sources in the agency and cited by Ukrainska Pravda. The ISW said that air defense systems in Leningrad Oblast may not be well equipped to counter attacks from Ukraine because they were not designed with southern attacks in mind. Russia has historically arrayed its air defense in the area to defend against hypothetical NATO attacks, analysts write. Russian forces are now building up a Leningrad military district along the border with Finland in order to intimidate NATO members and possibly prepare for a future war with NATO. Now, Anders Puck-Nielsen has done an absolutely fascinating video on this topic, potential future war between NATO and Russia and how that might play out, because a full direct confrontation does not seem likely, but a continuation of hybrid and informational warfare may be their best option to underline the alliance. I'll put a link to that video in the description of this video. But continued Ukrainian strikes on Russian military assets in the region may force Russia to change its tactics. Ukrainian strikes in the Leningrad Oblast may prompt Russian forces to reposition short-range air defense systems along expected flight routes of Ukrainian drones to defend potential targets of strategic value. But there has been a lot of debate amongst Ukrainian analysts and opposition Russian journalists that actually Russia does not physically have enough systems to defend all of the strategic energy infrastructure that powers its military machine. And with Ukrainian long-range drones, there may be many hundreds of targets that are now within range. It seems unlikely that Russia will have the capability to defend all of these. And so Ukraine has found a soft underbelly with which to hit the Russian military machine and, of course, the civilian economy as well. And the ISW agrees. If Ukraine continues to target deep rear areas within Russia, it may increase pressure on Russia's air defenses overall. And why are these attacks so important and so strategic at this time? Well, we've mentioned already the lack of shells, and Umerov, the Minister of Defense in Ukraine, has emphasized how important and dangerous this situation is. Umerov says Ukraine has increasingly critical shortages of artillery shells. Ukraine is being confronted with a critical shortage of artillery shells, it was reported in Bloomberg on January the 31st. According to a document issued by the defense minister Rustem Umerov and sent to Ukraine's European allies, was seen by Bloomberg. Russia is currently able to fire 3 times more shells per day, Umerov said. Foreign defense deliveries have begun to run dry as $61 billion in aid from the US remains stuck in Congress due to political infighting, and Hungary blocked a $54 billion Ukraine aid package from the EU in December. Now, there's news on that today. That vote has apparently gone through. We will cover that in a minute. Ukrainian officials and foreign allies have acknowledged that the impasse on aid has impacted Ukraine's battlefield capabilities. Umerov said that Ukraine is currently unable to fire more than 2,000 shells per day, around a third of Russia's average shell usage. And in talking to people who are much closer to the front lines, there are very real consequences to this. Across many parts of the front line, Ukraine knows where Russian forces are concentrated. They know where tanks and critical armored vehicles are located, but without significant shells, they're finding it far harder to hit these targets. And that, of course, is a lost opportunity. It is a lost opportunity that Russia can't fail to notice. And as we know, Russia will always take advantage of weakness. It will always take advantage either propagandistically or on the battlefield to make advances where it finds an enemy cannot adequately push back against its force. Ukraine must be able to at least match Russia's artillery output, Umerov said. The side with the most ammunition to fight usually wins, he wrote. And that questions what we are doing in the West, so-called allies of Ukraine. We are encouraging them to continue the fight. We are encouraging them to believe in survival and in a kind of victory, although that is not clearly defined. And yet we are not giving Ukraine the vital materials and ammunition it needs to stay in that fight. This is costing many hundreds, many thousands of Ukrainian lives. And we are also creating opportunities for Russia to take advantage of this. We're creating a high-risk scenario where Russia thinks the application of further force might translate into some kind of victory. This does not amount to managing the situation or managing risk. By not supplying Ukraine with the critical material and ammunition it needs, we are potentially escalating the situation by enabling Russian aggression to have a perceived win and a perceived advantage. This is extremely dangerous. And Ukraine is also trying to tackle a critical problem with manpower. And they have once again debated an update to the draft law on mobilization. Now, I think that story about ammunition and mobilization are intimately linked. It will become harder and harder to get people to join the army if there is a belief that they do not have the right equipment and the right munitions to do the job and give them a good chance of surviving and beating back the Russians. This is almost a catch-22 situation we are creating here. Disincentive for Ukrainians to join their military if the West is not supplying Ukraine to win. In fact, not even supplying Ukraine to survive at this point. The Cabinet of Ministers submitted an updated draft law on mobilization to Ukraine's parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, Ukraine's defense ministry, announced on January the 30th. The updated bill sets out transparent rules for the mobilization process, as well as necessary regulation of the rights of servicemen and conscripts. Of course, there is still a debate. Many lawmakers do not entirely agree with all aspects of the law, so we should expect some back and forth until it is actually put on the statute books. The government originally submitted the bill on mobilization to Parliament on December the 25th and included within it provisions on further conscription and restrictions on draft evaders. Lawmakers later returned the bill for revision on January the 11th after weeks of public debate and controversy in Ukraine. Previous versions of the law proposed, among other things, to restrict the rights of those who evade military registration and service. Such restrictions included a ban on travelling abroad and making transactions with movable and immovable property. Ukraine's human rights ombudsman Dmytro Lubinets said that such restrictions would contradict Ukraine's constitution. Additionally, some officials pointed out that these provisions could create corruption risks. The new version of the bill includes specific provisions on rest periods, mandatory military training for recruits, financial compensation, as well as legal protections for registered servicemen to travel inside the country. Now, this is how a democracy works. There is a cut and thrust of debate to decide how to move forward, and eventually you need a certain amount of consensus before a critical law like this passes. And it is in stark contrast to the rubber stamp parliament in Russia, which has sent many hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens to their deaths in a pointless war that has seen convicts sent en masse in meat-wave attacks. And in Russia, there is no such debate about the fine points of a law. There is no such sensitivity to rule of law, human rights, and the rights of servicemen at all. This is fundamentally why Ukraine is fighting, not only to decide their future, but to ensure that that future is based on democratic principles and the rule of law. But some people in the West do get it. And this is an important story, I think, here. And it is reported that a Navy commander has said that Kiev would win faster if it was allowed to hit deep inside Russia with Western weapons. And this has been taboo up until now. But as we've said on the channel numerous times, this is another of those restrictions that prevent Ukraine from actually winning decisively in this war and prevent Ukraine from pushing Russia out of its territory. Ukrainian naval commander Alexei Nizhny told Sky News that the state of the war would have been very different if allies had not placed restrictions on Kiev on the use of Western weapons. In an interview published on January the 27th, the Vice Admiral signaled that Kiev would be able to win the war far faster if it had permission to fire Western weapons against targets inside of Russia. We must have the capabilities to make sure that Russia will give up forever the thought of even looking in Ukraine's direction, he said. Throughout the full-scale war, Ukraine has regularly struck Russia's Black Sea fleet and sunk many ships, as we mentioned at the start of this video. These strikes have caused almost certainly severe damage to the fleet, the UK Defence Ministry has reported. The Russian fleet's ability to continue wider regional security patrols and enforce its de facto blockade of Ukrainian ships is therefore significantly reduced, it added. And this is a question that many decision makers in the West have been avoiding. But as the war drags on, and as Ukraine gets bolder and bolder in its strikes against Russian oil terminals and strategic objectives, which we're discussing, then this topic of taking the war to Russia and making the costs of its war so high that it is forced to reconsider its aggression is absolutely critical. Otherwise, the reverse is true. Russia believes that the West is weak. Russia believes that we have placed Kiev in a straitjacket and that we are, in some ways, committed to an outcome that is best a stalemate. At worst, an improved Russian position on the battlefield, which would make any future negotiation far tougher for Ukraine. You'll also know on this channel that we generally don't believe that a negotiated outcome is at all in Ukraine's interests, and that Russia is a credible negotiation partner in any future deal. And here is another sign of Western weakness and prevarication. Ex-NATO chief says that not inviting Ukraine to join the alliance gives Putin an incentive to continue the war. NATO should extend an invitation to Ukraine at the Washington summit in July, said the alliance's former Secretary General, Anders Fogh Rasmussen. It could serve as an instrument to ending Russia's war, he said. I know that NATO's invitation to Ukraine would be controversial and at least an unprecedented decision to take to invite a country already at war into NATO. And I know this would be used as a counter-argument from those who are skeptical about extending such an invitation. But that's an extremely dangerous argument to use because it gives Russian President Vladimir Putin an incentive to continue his war to prevent NATO membership of Ukraine. It gives de facto Putin a veto right, but that's not acceptable, he explained, adding that this would send an extremely dangerous message to the rest of the world, such as to China regarding Taiwan. The high-profile diplomat's visit to Kiev comes amid the world's fading attention to Ukraine and the continued stalling of EU and US aid. Although, as I say, in a minute we'll come to EU aid, which has only just been unblocked. Ukraine officially applied for NATO membership in September 2022. The incumbent NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said on January the 28th interview that Ukraine would join NATO at a certain stage without elaborating further. Well, this sounds like more of the as long as it takes, open-ended, weak strategy that has allowed Russia to continue its aggression and has given Russia false optimism that it can still secure a victory. Most analysts, however, consider it extremely unlikely that NATO would extend an invitation to Ukraine before the war with Russia is over. And now we come to that story about EU aid. And it has just been announced that all 27 EU leaders agree on a 50 billion euro aid package for Ukraine. All 27 leaders of the EU member states agreed on an additional 50 billion euros, $54 billion support package for Ukraine within the EU budget, European Council President Charles Michel announced on February the 1st. This locks in steadfast, long-term, predictable funding for Ukraine, he said. The crucial funding was blocked during an EU summit last December by Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. A decision to provide the financial aid package was expected to be discussed during the European Council summit on February the 1st. This is a good day for Europe, President Ursula von der Leyen posted on X. EU member states one more time show their solidarity and unity in the actions with the Ukrainian people to withstand the war. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said on January the 30th that the EU will find a way to pass the package with or without the support of Orban. The same day, Orban begrudgingly signaled his willingness to drop his opposition to the aid package, and that comes amidst rumours that huge pressure was placed on Orban, with the EU getting tough and threatening to remove Hungary's voting rights and their ability to veto legislation, especially around Ukraine. And now we turn to an interesting story about a decree made by President Zelensky on Russian lands historically inhabited by Ukrainians. And this is a fascinating story which in some ways turns the tables on Russian claims over Donbass that they are Russian lands. The decree titled on the territories of the Russian Federation historically inhabited by Ukrainians, in the directive, the Ukrainian government has collaborated with experts to develop a plan aimed at researching, publicizing, and safeguarding the cultural identities of Ukrainians who've lived in the borders of modern-day Russia, including regions such as Krasnodar Krai, Belgorod, Bryansk, Voronezh, Kursk, Rostov regions, which all border Ukraine. It's important to know that ethnic Ukrainians are represented in almost every corner of the world, even in the territories of the aggressor state, said Vladislav Havrilov, historian and researcher with the Where Are Our People project. There is a need for systematic awareness of efforts to strive to establish communication and urge these individuals to actively resist Russian aggression and advocate for Ukraine on international platforms, if only out of respect for their historical roots. The work of historians over the years has already revealed that some of the Ukrainians who lived in those border regions harbored concerns about being considered part of Russia. Now, I'll put a link to this article because there's a huge amount of material which is absolutely fascinating, and it is also incredible to see Ukraine asserting itself, even when bordered by such a belligerent and aggressive neighbor. Now, we've got a couple more stories before we venture into Clown World. This is an interesting one by Matthew Light, where he talks about how far Western academics are targets for Russian intelligence. This is in the Moscow Times. The case of Vyacheslav Morozov, the professor of political science at Tartu University, who was arrested by Estonian police and is now being prosecuted on charges of engaging in espionage for Russia, has brought to the fore concerns about Russian spies targeting academics and related professionals in Western countries. And for Matthew, who is himself an academic who has visited many countries in the post-Soviet region, this arrest has stirred up some distressing thoughts about how far academia might be penetrated by the Russian security services, and it has solidified an impression he has that members of the academic profession are at significant risk from the intelligence services of Russia, as well as other hostile authoritarian regimes. And it's interesting, he says, that despite his 20-odd years experience as a student and professor, he at no point received any university or government advice or guidance about how to detect or respond to hostile intelligence interest over time, whether it be from Russia or any other state. But of course, the approach needs to be worked out with some degree of sensitivity as we enter a very intense period of new Cold War with Russia. We need to avoid a McCarthyite witch hunt, intrusive surveillance, and university entanglement with the police, defense, or counterintelligence bodies, writes Matthew Light. But sharing information amongst colleagues and developing best practices within universities and professional associations must be done to ensure that doctoral students and junior scholars are given the appropriate training to prevent them from becoming victims of foreign intelligence service operations. And I'm going to quickly cover a couple of stories here on the Russian economy. And we reported in a recent episode about the potential overheating of the Russian economy because of the huge injection of funds from the military-industrial complex as a result of Russia's war. Here are two interesting stories which perhaps we need to greet with a little bit of skepticism. So the Russian economy, Russian banks post record profits despite Western sanctions, reports the Financial Times. Households took on subsidized mortgages and deals at the same time as financial groups leaving the country rose, according to the central bank. Whether this indicates a dramatic overheating or not, and whether this is a kind of banking bubble, remains to be seen. Another report from the IMF that raises Russian growth outlook as the war boosts the economy. A new 2024 forecast of a 2.6% rise doubles the previous prediction and prompts questions over sanctions against Moscow. Again, as in our previous conversation with Konstantin Samoilov, we explore this and question whether this is real economic growth or artificially boosted economic growth as a result of war, because the investment in munitions might provide a temporary hit, but it does nothing for the medium to long-term health of the consumer economy. Stuff is built, soldiers are paid, but they end up being destroyed in Ukraine. So that is not a long-term benefit for the Russian economy. And before we tackle the so-called election in Russia, let's look quickly at a story on Belarus. Belarus gets far too little attention and very much sits in the shadow of Russia and Ukraine. But here's a story about KGB officers in Belarus detaining 37 as fresh crackdowns on political opposition are rolled out. This is from Novaya Gazeta. At least 37 people were detained by authorities in Belarus on Wednesday in a renewed crackdown on the families of regime critics, the country's leading human rights group has reported. KGB officers are visiting the relatives of political prisoners and former political prisoners en masse today, said Minsk-based Human Rights Center Vyazna, going on to warn regime critics and their families to be aware of the crackdown and to clean up their correspondence, which could potentially be of interest to the authorities. Now, whether this is an indication of increasing weakness in Lukashenko's hold on power cannot be said with any certainty, but the exiled opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya warned of yet another wave of searches and mass detentions in Belarus and called upon the global community to respond decisively to this atrocity against civil society. And the arrests come ahead of an expected meeting between Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko and Russian President Vladimir Putin this week. Earlier this month, Lukashenko signed amendments into law that protect him and his family from prosecution should he ever voluntarily step down. Now let's turn to the election in Russia. And this is a huge disappointment that the Western media still seems to cover the Russian election as if it is some kind of organic process, as if there is a real sense of jeopardy here, that Putin is under threat from a new critic and candidate, Boris Nadezhdin. This is, of course, false. Russia's political system is an entire facade. It is a fake, a puppet show, and Boris Nadezhdin is just another face in that manipulative process. But nonetheless, Russians waited for hours in the freezing temperatures across the country last week to add their signatures in support of Boris Nadezhdin's candidacy in the 17th of March presidential election, the only potential candidate standing on a platform to end the war with Ukraine, inverted commas. And in fact, anyone who understands Russian has seen some of his recent videos. They are not quite as perhaps oppositional as one would come to expect. He has said some extremely suspect things about Ukrainians really being Russians, and that's why there is a stalemate in the war, and the Russian opposition is in absolute tatters. Any politician daring to put themselves forward as a credible alternative to Putin is either dead or in prison or exiled. There's no independent press, and there is strict military censorship. So how does someone like Boris Nadezhdin get through the first round of the process to put himself forward as a potential candidate? So on the one hand, Nadezhdin is openly saying that Putin is dragging Russia into the past and that Putin has made a fatal mistake in invading Ukraine. We've been through turmoil and collapse twice in the past century, and now we are entering another rut of authoritarianism and militarism. In his manifesto, he said that he would not be able to forgive himself if he does not try to stop it. On the other hand, he wouldn't have got this far in the process without some kind of official backing and support. So is this another massive disinformation campaign? Nadezhdin is supported by Ekaterina Dunsova, a journalist from the small town of Rzhiv in the Tver region of Western Russia. She vehemently opposed the war in Ukraine and planned to run for the presidency herself until the Central Election Commission rejected her application to register her electoral association. So what's going on here? Is this an entirely fake initiative, or is it that this sort of puppet official opposition character has perhaps gone off script? Well, this is something we will have to watch closely. If there are moves by the state to try and debar him as a candidate, then perhaps the story of him going rogue and having some genuine opposition credentials might start to be proved true. If, however, he proceeds to the next round of the process, it is highly likely that he is, in fact, just a kind of stalking horse, fake candidate manufactured by Putin's regime. And lastly, let's turn to Clown World. The propagandistic talking heads in a recent video concede that Russia may lose the war in Ukraine. Margarita Semenyan says that Russians don't want to live a normal life, in some way trying to justify the huge suffering and pointless death that many of them are experiencing as a result of Putin's war. Margarita Semenyan, as many of you know, is one of the weirdest and most toxic of the propagandistic talking heads. Vladimir Solovyov complains that there are very few Russians left, and he's not, I don't think, referring to the fact that so many have been killed in Ukraine. I'm not actually sure what he's referring to there. True patriots, true believers, it's not quite clear what he means by real Russians. Vladimir Solovyov continues to talk about Boris Nadezhdin, that he will be taken down, arrested, and thrown in prison for his defiant presidential candidacy. This outburst in no way disqualifies Nadezhdin from being a propagandistic campaign in his own right. This could just be another attempt to muddy the waters, confuse people, and create the impression that Russia is not as authoritarian as it actually is in reality. But what all of the propagandists are completely united on is the power of Donald Trump, even prior to the US election, to actually disrupt the supply of funds and material support to Ukraine. Trump is completely celebrated and lauded by the Russian propagandists. In some way, they think that he is the greatest hope for Russia, not just in its war in Ukraine, but in its wider struggle to destroy NATO, to gain some kind of control and influence over the whole of Europe, and to disrupt the post-war order based on international law and trade. They see Trump as somebody who could bring the entire edifice of Western power crashing down and who has the potential to hand them a so-called victory in Ukraine. For people who are still in the MAGA cult, it's incredibly important to listen to what Russian propagandists are saying about him and the hopes they place in his potential victory in the upcoming US elections. That's enough from Clown World. See you on the next episode of Silicon Bytes.